The crystal chandelier suspended above the Rutledge dining table was an 18th century French antique. As an estate appraiser, I knew it carried a market value higher than my first car, but the silence expanding across the room carried a much heavier price. We were gathered in the heart of historic Charleston, South Carolina, a city where pedigree operates as a second currency and hospitality is often wielded like a well-dressed weapon. The dinner was intended as an intimate celebration of my engagement to Weston Rutledge. Instead, it was turning into a public execution. My adoptive mother, Caroline, reached over and tapped her sterling silver spoon against the rim of her champagne flute. It was a delicate, crystalline chime, the kind usually reserved for a warm, tearful toast. I felt the familiar knot form in my stomach. She leaned across the table toward my future mother-in-law, Victoria Rutledge, deploying her sweetest, most venomous southern drawl. It was the voice she saved for returning bruised fruit to the grocer. "We just want you to know her background," Caroline sighed, waving a manicured hand in my direction as though swatting away a gnat. Bianca was a charity adoption from a rather unfortunate area. She isn't really one of us, and we would just hate for her roots to embarrass your family down the line. The air in the room vanished. Beneath the mahogany table, Weston's hand tightened over mine, his knuckles turning pale. Across from me, my older sister Savannah adjusted her linen napkin to hide a satisfied smirk. I kept my gaze steady on my plate. I braced my spine against the back of the antique dining chair, preparing for the familiar sting of high society rejection. I had spent 18 years learning how to absorb Caroline's public humiliations without flinching, assuming this would be the moment the Rutledge family realized they were making a terrible mistake. But Victoria Rutledge did not gasp. She did not clutch her pearls or cast a nervous glance my way. She possessed a generational assurance that required zero theatrics. With deliberate, agonizing slowness, Victoria placed her silver oyster fork down on the pressed white tablecloth. She pushed her chair back, the wooden legs making a quiet scrape against the hardwood floor. She stood up, smoothing the front of her tailored silk blouse. She looked Caroline dead in the eye, the polite warmth stripped from her face, leaving only cold, unyielding granite. Then Victoria delivered 7 words that shifted the balance of power in my life forever. "She belongs here. You clearly do not." Welcome back to QT Told Stories, where the quiet women finally stop apologizing and family secrets lose their leverage. How old were you when you realized your family's love came with an expiration date? Drop your age in the comments below, because it took me 22 years and 1 unforgettable dinner to finally understand my own worth. If you have ever been treated like a liability by the people who were supposed to protect you, stay close. To understand how my adoptive mother cornered herself in a room full of Charleston's oldest money, you have to go back to the day the sapphire ring went on my finger and the architecture of the Jade family began to crumble. To understand how a mother could attempt to socially execute her own daughter over a plate of imported oysters, you have to understand the architecture of the Jade family. I am an antique estate appraiser by trade. My daily life revolves around assessing the integrity of old structures, identifying where a foundation is sound and where the rot has settled deep into the grain. I learned early on that families are built exactly like furniture. Some are held together by sturdy, honest joints. Others rely on cheap glue and a thin veneer destined to splinter the moment real pressure is applied. I joined the household when I was 4 years old. My adoptive father, William, was a quiet man with a gentle demeanor who preferred the dust of auction houses to the glittering ballrooms of King Street. He was the one who placed a magnifying loupe in my hand when I was 10 years old. We would spend hours in his study, a room smelling of beeswax polish and old paper surrounded by history. He guided my fingers along the back of a mahogany dresser to feel the distinct irregular wedge of a genuine 18th century dovetail joint. He taught me to look past the surface polish and search for structural truth. To him, I was a daughter to be nurtured. To his wife, I was a public relations strategy to be managed. Caroline Jade operated within the vicious, velvet-lined hierarchy of Charleston society, where pedigree functions as a currency more vital than cash. She chaired the local philanthropic boards, organizing galas and silent auctions, with ruthless efficiency. Adopting a child from the foster system was her ultimate philanthropic accessory. I vividly recall the church luncheons of my childhood. Caroline would dress me in stiff, itchy lace collars and place a manicured hand on my shoulder, presenting me to the local newspaper photographers as her grandest act of charity. She would sigh and tell the other wives how rewarding it was to rescue a child from such a troubled background. The moment the flashbulb stopped firing, her hand would drop from my shoulder, and she would tell me to go wait quietly in the car so I would not wrinkle my dress. The fragile equilibrium of our home collapsed 5 years ago when William suffered a sudden, fatal heart attack in his study. The ambulance arrived too late. He left behind a complicated estate, a house full of silent clocks, and a gaping void in the center of my life. I was 17 years old, raw, with a grief that felt heavy enough to crush my lungs. But mourning was a luxury Caroline did not permit. She was too busy selecting the correct shade of black silk for the funeral and ensuring her name appeared prominently in the obituary. The shift in the household dynamics was swift and brutal. Without William there to act as a buffer, the thin veneer of maternal affection cracked and fell away. I ceased being a daughter and was quietly demoted to an unpaid estate manager, expected to catalog the very items my father had loved, while the house still smelled of his cologne. My sister Savannah is 3 years older and biological. She possesses the kind of effortless golden beauty that generations of Southern grooming are designed to produce. Savannah was raised to be an ornament polished and primed for a strategic marriage. Unfortunately, she was also raised to be willfully incompetent. While she could recite the lineage of every prominent family in the Lowcountry, she was incapable of reading a bank statement or operating the thermostat. The division of labor became the unwritten law of the property. Savannah attended charity luncheons. I audited the trust ledgers. Caroline hosted the Historic Preservation Society in the front parlor. I cataloged William's antique collections in the basement to ensure our insurance premiums remained accurate. I absorbed the quiet daily labor required to keep their aristocratic illusion afloat. If a pipe burst in the guest wing during a garden party, Caroline did not call a plumber. She summoned me through the back hallway, expecting me to manage the crisis in overalls while she poured sweet tea for her guests on the veranda. I recall a humid afternoon last summer sitting at the long oak table in the library with a stack of overdue credit notices. Savannah had managed to overdraw her checking account by thousands of dollars, purchasing imported silk linens and booking a luxury spa retreat she claimed she desperately needed for her mental health. I laid the printed statements in front of Caroline, explaining the math in neutral, measured tones. I showed her where the deficit was pulling from our operational funds. Instead of reprimanding Savannah, Caroline reached for a crystal decanter and poured herself a measure of gin. The ice clanked sharply against the glass. She looked at me with an expression of profound distaste. "You have such a transactional mind, Bianca," she murmured, taking a slow sip of her drink. "It is a very common trait. People born into our world understand that style requires investment. People from your background only see the price tag." The insult was precise, designed to remind me of the fundamental gap between us. Pedigree was everything in her circles, and she never let me forget that I was bankrupt in that department. Every time I fixed a problem, balanced a ledger, or appraised a family heirloom, the reward was a subtle reminder of my unworthiness. I was told repeatedly that I was the strong one. In the Jade household, being the strong one was not a compliment. It was a life sentence. It meant you were the workhorse, expected to bear the heavy loads without complaint, while the thoroughbreds rested in the shade. I learned to weaponize my silence to survive them. While Savannah threw tantrums over ruined hemlines and Caroline fretted over perceived social slights, I buried myself in my work. I earned my appraisal certifications faster than anyone in my cohort. I studied the history of silver, marks the grain of old woods, the subtle signatures of master craftsmen. I built a sanctuary in the details of inanimate objects, because objects do not lie. An antique tells you exactly what it is, if you know how to look. But living as a ghost in your own home takes a toll. I watched Savannah receive praise for simply existing, while my tangible contributions were swept under the rug. Caroline needed my competence, but she despised her reliance on it. My utility was the only thing keeping me under their roof, yet it was the very thing they resented. They wanted me small, grateful, and perpetually in their debt. I accepted this twisted arrangement because I believed it was the only version of family available to me. I thought the ledger of my adoption meant I owed them a lifetime of servitude to repay the debt of my rescue. That dynamic was stable, albeit toxic, as long as I remained in my designated place. The workhorse is not supposed to leave the paddock. The charity case is not supposed to outshine the biological heir. I was meant to stay in the shadows, managing the Jade estate, until I aged into a quiet, eccentric spinsterhood, invisible to the society that prized them. Then I attended an exclusive estate auction on Broad Street to authenticate a collection of maritime paintings. The room was crowded with investors and gallery owners, the air buzzing with polite competitive tension. I stood apart from the crowd, focused entirely on the intricate brushstrokes of a 19th century canvas. I was taking detailed notes in my leather portfolio, tracing the provenance in my mind, when a man stepped up beside me. He did not interrupt my work. He waited patiently until I lowered my pen, and then he asked a simple, highly intelligent question about the artist's use of natural light on the water. That man was Weston Rutledge. He carried the weight of one of the oldest names in the South, yet he spoke to me with a genuine curiosity that I had never experienced in my own home. He did not see a charity case or a useful piece of staff when he looked at me. He saw a peer, an expert, a woman worthy of his undivided attention. And the moment he began pulling me into the light of Charleston high society, the architecture of my mother's control began to groan under the sudden, terrifying strain. The baseline conflict of my existence was a quiet, grinding extraction of my usefulness, a slow draining of my energy to keep the Jade household afloat. I had accepted this dynamic as a permanent reality, treating it as the inevitable cost of my lodging. The true escalation, the seismic shift that transformed my adoptive mother from a passive oppressor into an active enemy, began the night Weston Rutledge asked me to marry him. Weston belongs to a demographic of old money Charleston that operates on a different frequency than the rest of the city. His family possesses the kind of generational wealth that does not need to announce itself. They have streets named after their ancestors and endowments at local universities. While Caroline chased invitations to the right galas, and Savannah spent small fortunes on debutante gowns trying to catch the eye of men exactly like him, Weston preferred quiet corners and genuine conversation. He is observant, fiercely loyal, and remarkably unimpressed by fake charm. He saw through the polished veneer of the Jade family within 10 minutes of meeting them, yet he treated me with a respect I had never known. He courted me not as a charity case to be pitied, but as a woman whose intellect he admired. The proposal was understated and perfect, taking place on a quiet stretch of Sullivan's Island as the sun dipped below the horizon. When he opened the velvet box, he revealed an heirloom sapphire. It was a flawless cornflower blue stone surrounded by old mine-cut diamonds, a piece of Rutledge family history that carried more weight than any modern diamond ever could. When he slid it onto my finger, it felt like a promise of sanctuary. I believed, foolishly, that the sheer, undeniable prestige of the ring would finally force my family to treat me with a measure of respect. I returned to the Jade historic home later that evening, the heavy front door clicking shut behind me. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish and expensive floral arrangements. I found Caroline and Savannah in the front parlor. Savannah was scrolling through her phone on the velvet settee, while Caroline sat near the fireplace, nursing her evening gin. I walked into the room, my hands shaking slightly, and announced the news. I held up my left hand, allowing the warm lamplight to catch the facets of the sapphire. I expected a polite, strained congratulation. I expected a forced smile. What I received was a physical manifestation of shock. Caroline did not offer a single word of joy. The blood drained from her face, leaving her skin an ashen, sickly gray. Her eyes locked onto the sapphire, and her jaw tightened so hard I could hear her teeth grind. Savannah dropped her phone onto the settee. She stared at my hand, her mouth falling open as the reality of the situation registered. The scapegoat, the unpaid estate manager, the adopted charity case was suddenly marrying into the absolute apex of Southern society. Savannah stood up, her chest heaving. She did not look at me. She let out a sharp, choked sob, turned on her heel, and fled the parlor. Her rapid footsteps echoed up the grand staircase, followed by the violent slam of her bedroom door. I stood in the center of the parlor, the silence stretching between Caroline and me. My engagement was not a celebration to them. It was a severe, catastrophic disruption of the hierarchy. Savannah was the biological golden child meticulously groomed for high society. She was supposed to secure the prominent marriage, the historic estate, the elevated status. I was supposed to remain in the shadows, fixing the leaks in their roof and balancing their checkbooks until I faded into obscurity. Leaving the golden child in the dust was a transgression they could not process. The subtle sabotage began the very next day. Caroline realized she could not forbid a grown woman from marrying, so she shifted her tactics. She decided to poison the well. She started inviting Weston over for afternoon tea or evening cocktails under the guise of welcoming him into the family fold. I would sit beside him on the sofa, watching my mother ply him with expensive bourbon and weaponized concern. She utilized the classic Southern strategy of disguising insults as prayers. "Weston, darling," Caroline sighed one evening, adjusting her pearl necklace, "you have such a generous heart taking our Bianca on. We just worry about her. We love her, of course, but you never really know what you get with closed adoptions. The genetics are such a mystery. We have had to manage some rather unpredictable behavioral issues over the years." She let the sentence hang in the air, a toxic cloud meant to plant seeds of doubt in his mind. She wanted him to view me as unstable, tainted by my origins, a risk to his pristine family lineage. She painted a picture of a troubled, volatile girl who required constant supervision, hoping Weston would quietly withdraw his proposal to protect the Rutledge name. Weston possesses the emotional intelligence of a seasoned hostage negotiator. He evaluates every word, registers every hidden motive, and never surrenders his leverage. He took a slow sip of his bourbon, placed the crystal glass onto a coaster, and smiled a polite, devastating smile. "I appreciate your concern," Caroline, Weston replied, his voice smooth and untroubled, "but Bianca possesses the most brilliant, grounded mind I have ever encountered. I consider myself exceptionally fortunate to be the one she chose." He did not argue with her. He did not raise his voice. He simply neutralized her poison with undeniable truth. Then he reached across the sofa cushions, laced his fingers through mine, and held my hand tighter. He let Caroline know without a shadow of a doubt that her tactics were useless. I watched Caroline's reaction closely, utilizing my training as an appraiser to read the micro-expressions on her face. When Weston defended me, she did not look merely disappointed or annoyed. Her eyes widened and a subtle tremor passed through her hands. The ring on my finger had triggered a panic in my mother that I could not quite comprehend. It was not just jealousy over Savannah's bruised ego. It was not just the snobbery of a woman losing control of her favorite punching bag. As the days ticked closer to the wedding, Caroline began pacing the hallways late at night. She started drinking more heavily, her pristine facade cracking to reveal a jagged, frantic energy. There was a raw, clawing desperation in her eyes every time she looked at the sapphire on my hand. She was terrified of this marriage taking place. She was looking at me not as a daughter leaving the nest, but as an asset she was about to lose forever. The depth of her fear made no logical sense until a rainy Tuesday afternoon when she walked into my home office and slid a thick manila folder across my desk, revealing the true nature of her terror. My home office occupies a converted sunroom at the rear of the property, overlooking a neglected patch of azalea bushes. It serves as my sanctuary, a quiet space where the chaotic, performative demands of the main house cannot penetrate. 2 weeks after Weston placed the heirloom sapphire on my finger, I sat at my drafting table under the harsh, honest glare of a halogen lamp. I was evaluating a massive, complete service of early 20th century sterling silver flatware. I held a heavy dinner fork up to the light, rotating the handle slowly to examine the hallmark stamped near the tines. My adoptive father, William, had spent countless afternoons teaching me how to read these tiny stamped codes. He taught me that silver never lies about its origins, provided you possess the patience to interpret the markings. A lion passant indicates true sterling. A specific anchor denotes the city of origin. I learned to spot a forgery by tracing the inconsistent depth of a manufacturer engraving. My entire career relies upon the singular skill of looking very closely at items that other people want me to merely glance over. The heavy wooden door to my office swung open without a knock, shattering the quiet rhythm of my work. Caroline stepped across the threshold. The distinct scent of her expensive botanical gin arrived a fraction of a second before the overwhelming wave of her manufactured panic. She tore a tailored linen day dress, but her usual immaculate presentation was frayed around the edges. Her posture was rigidly tight, her breathing shallow and deliberately uneven. She crossed the room with frantic, purposeful strides and slapped a thick manila folder onto my desk, right over my velvet presentation cloth. She stood over my drafting table, pressing her fingertips against her temples, feigning a sudden crushing migraine. "Routine estate paperwork," she declared, her voice stretched thin, vibrating with a frantic energy she struggled to suppress. "Savannah got herself into a tiny legal bind, a fender bender out on the highway. It is nothing serious, just a minor dispute over liability, but the other driver is being incredibly litigious. The trust lawyers need your signature to release some contingency funds from your father's estate to settle the matter quietly. It is just a formality." On the surface, the story was highly plausible. Savannah possessed a documented history of treating traffic laws as optional suggestions. 3 years ago, she totaled a leased luxury sedan and walked away without a single consequence, leaving me to field the calls from the insurance adjusters while Caroline arranged for a replacement vehicle. Savannah, causing a wreck and requiring a financial bailout, was the most normal event that could occur in our household. Caroline banked on my ingrained habit of cleaning up my sister's messes to push the paperwork through without scrutiny. But Caroline had made a fundamental miscalculation. She forgot her own daughter's profession. I pushed the silver fork aside and pulled the manila folder toward the center of my desk. I flipped open the heavy cardstock cover. The pages inside were dense with complex legal formatting, printed on the premium watermarked paper utilized by Charleston's most expensive estate attorneys. I ran my eyes down the first page, skipping past the boilerplate introductions and scanning directly for the operative clauses. The document contains zero mention of a vehicular accident liability settlements or contingency disbursements. It was a sweeping, irrevocable amendment to the structural terms of the Jade Family Trust. When William drafted his will, he understood the predatory nature of the society he lived in, and he understood his wife. To protect me, he placed my inheritance in an ironclad trust entirely walled off from Caroline's administrative reach. The stipulations were clear. The funds would vest and transfer to my absolute control upon my 25th birthday or upon the date of my legal marriage, whichever occurred first. My engagement to Weston had accelerated the timeline. The moment I stood at an altar and said my vows, the protective barrier around my trust would dissolve, placing a substantial fortune directly into my hands and permanently out of Caroline's grasp. The document sitting on my desk was a complete surrender of my rights. By signing on the dotted line, I would willingly transfer the entirety of my protected trust directly into Caroline's discretionary control. It was not a release for a fender bender. It was a financial execution designed to strip me of my independence before I could ever claim it. I did not gasp. I did not throw the papers back at her or demand an explanation. I maintained the exact same neutral analytical expression I use when informing a client that their prized family heirloom is actually a cheap reproduction. I closed the manila folder and rested both of my hands flat on top of it. "I will need to read this over, Mom," I said smoothly, keeping my tone perfectly level. The mask of the distressed, concerned mother dissolved instantly. Her eyes flashed with a sudden, raw, unfiltered fury. The polite veneer of Charleston decorum shattered, revealing the vicious desperation underneath. Her hands curled into tight fists at her sides, her knuckles turning white. She stepped closer to the desk, attempting to use her physical presence to intimidate me into compliance. "Family helps family, Bianca," she snapped, her voice dropping into a harsh, guttural register I had never heard before. "Do not be ungrateful after everything we did for you. We took you in, we clothed you, we gave you a name that commands respect in this city. You owe us your life, and I expect you to sign that document by the end of the day." I did not break eye contact, nor did I move my hands from the folder. I had spent my childhood shrinking to accommodate her anger, but the woman sitting in the chair was no longer a frightened little girl desperate for approval. I was an independent adult with an heirloom sapphire on my finger and a profound understanding of my own legal rights. I knew exactly what she was trying to steal. "I will review the terms," I repeated, my voice steady, offering no concessions. Caroline realized she could not bully me into submission in that moment. Her chest heaved with indignation. She spun around her linen dress, snapping around her legs, and marched out of the sunroom. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving me alone in the quiet hum of the halogen lamp. I sat in the silence, tracing the edge of the manila folder with my index finger. The ring on my left hand caught the light, gleaming with a cool blue fire. The puzzle pieces finally snapped together with terrifying clarity. Her panic over my engagement was not born of jealousy. It was born of impending financial ruin. The baseline conflict of emotional neglect had just escalated into a high-stakes war for my future. I kept the folder securely on my desk. The clock had started ticking, and I knew her desperation would soon spill over into the most vulnerable public arenas of my bridal preparations. The boutique on King Street occupied a restored 19th century bank building, its original marble floors polished to a mirror finish. The air inside smelled of fresh gardenias and the distinct crisp scent of imported silk. It was an environment designed to intimidate, a hushed sanctuary where price tags were considered gauche and appointments required referrals from established clients. Caroline secured our spot weeks ago, treating the fitting less like a maternal milestone and more like a tactical deployment. Ever since I kept her manila folder locked inside my desk drawer, her urgency had curdled into a cold, relentless warfare. She could not force my hand physically, so she resorted to the only weapon she truly understood. She intended to erode my confidence until I surrendered my independence, just to make the psychological bruising stop. Victoria Rutledge had graciously accepted the invitation to join us. She sat on a curved velvet sofa near the viewing pedestal, her posture impeccable, dressed in a tailored navy sheath that probably cost more than a year of college tuition. She held a delicate porcelain teacup, observing the dynamics of the room with quiet calculation. Victoria did not need to flaunt her status. When you belong to a family that helped establish the city grid, you do not feel the need to prove you own the pavement. Caroline, however, operated from a place of perpetual deficit. She perched on the edge of the adjacent sofa, her designer handbag clutched tightly in her lap, radiating a brittle, frantic energy. She was desperate to demonstrate her superiority to the Rutledge matriarch, using me as the necessary collateral. This tactic was a familiar pattern in the Jade household. Savannah possessed a documented history of hijacking my personal milestones. During my high school graduation, she staged a highly dramatic breakup with her boyfriend in the parking lot, ensuring my parents spent the entire afternoon consoling her while I walked across the stage to an empty section of bleachers. When I attended my senior prom, she accidentally spilled a glass of red wine down the front of my dress an hour before my date arrived, citing a sudden dizzy spell. They had spent my entire life teaching me that attempting to shine would only invite punishment. Today was meant to be the ultimate enforcement of that rule. The bridal attendant, a woman with a measuring tape draped like a rosary around her neck, helped me step into the gown. It was a structural masterpiece, crafted from heavy ivory Mikado silk. The bodice featured an elegant architectural drape that flowed seamlessly into a sweeping train. There was no lace, no tulle, no unnecessary embellishment. It relied entirely on the purity of its cut and the quality of the material. As I pulled the fabric up and allowed the attendant to secure the hidden corset, I felt an unexpected surge of armor settle over my skin. I did not look like the charity case they raised. I looked like a woman preparing to inherit a dynasty. I stepped out of the dressing room and ascended the low, circular viewing pedestal. The boutique was lined with floor-to-ceiling mirrors reflecting the gown from every possible angle. The natural light filtering through the storefront windows caught the subtle sheen of the silk, casting a warm glow across the room. For a fleeting second, genuine silence descended. Then the orchestrated sabotage began. Savannah sat next to Caroline, swirling a flute of complimentary champagne. She offered a tight, dismissive laugh that echoed sharply against the marble walls. She tilted her head, her gaze sweeping over the gown with overt disdain. "It's a bit aristocratic for you, isn't it, Bianca?" Savannah scoffed, her voice pitched perfectly to ensure Victoria heard every syllable. I mean, it's a beautiful dress, but it looks a little severe on your frame. You don't want to look like you're playing dress-up in someone else's closet on your wedding day. Maybe we should look at something a bit more casual, something that suits your personality better. Caroline immediately leaned forward to capitalize on the opening, her eyes glittering with predatory delight. She turned her body toward Victoria, adopting a tone of weary, long-suffering maternal concern. "We've tried for years to teach her elegance," Caroline sighed, shaking her head in mock sorrow. "We paid for the finest etiquette tutors, enrolled her in the best programs, but blood will out, I suppose. She's always had such common tastes. It's a tragedy, really, when a girl cannot recognize her own limitations. We just hope Weston understands that she might need some extra guidance navigating your social circles." The insult was designed to be lethal. They wanted to strip me naked in front of my future mother-in-law to expose me as an imposter wrapping herself in stolen silk. They expected me to shrink to apologize, to rush back into the dressing room with tears stinging my eyes, proving their point that I was too fragile and unrefined to handle the pressure of the Rutledge name. I didn't flinch. I kept my chin elevated and shifted my gaze to the large mirror directly in front of the pedestal. In the reflection, I bypassed my own image and looked straight at Victoria Rutledge. She wasn't looking at me with pity. She wasn't recoiling from the alleged horror of my common roots. Instead, her eyes were fixed squarely on Caroline. Victoria possessed a sharp, discerning intellect honed by decades of navigating philanthropic boards and ruthless political fundraisers. She saw right through the performance. She was studying Caroline the way a seasoned biologist studies a remarkably stupid insect that has wandered into the wrong habitat. There was no outrage on her face, only a clinical freezing assessment of a woman committing social suicide. I felt the tension drain from my shoulders. The power dynamic in the room crystallized. Caroline was fighting a war she had already lost, wielding weapons that no longer cut my skin. I refused to bleed for them. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction, nor would I validate their cruelty by acknowledging it. I smoothed the heavy silk skirt with my hands, enjoying the crisp rustle of the fabric. I turned away from the mirrors, focusing my attention entirely on the bridal attendant, who stood frozen, clearly uncomfortable with the venom spilling across her showroom. "I love the structure of the bodice," I told the attendant, keeping my voice bright, professional, and unbothered. "The tailoring is exceptional. However, let's drop the hem an inch. The drape needs just a bit more length to sweep properly when I walk, especially considering the height of the heels I plan to wear." The attendant blinked, startled by my calm demeanor, then quickly nodded and produced a box of pins. She knelt at my feet, her hands moving expertly along the hemline, eager to focus on her craft rather than the toxic family dynamic playing out on the velvet sofas. I glanced back at the seating area. Savannah's smug smile faltered, her champagne flute hanging forgotten in her hand. Caroline sat rigidly, her knuckles white where she gripped her handbag. Her calculated strike had landed on solid stone and shattered. Instead of breaking my spirit, her words had simply evaporated into the fragrant air of the boutique, leaving her looking petty and desperate. Victoria reached for her porcelain cup. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her Earl Grey tea. She placed the cup back onto its saucer with a soft click. She didn't utter a single word in Caroline's defense, nor did she offer polite filler to ease the awkwardness. Her silence was a fortress, and she allowed Caroline to sit outside its walls, exposed and humiliated by her own failure. Stepping off the pedestal that afternoon, I realized the rules of engagement had permanently shifted. The trust document still sat, unsigned, in my desk drawer, a ticking clock that Caroline could no longer control through subtle manipulation or public shaming. Her failure to provoke me at the bridal boutique stripped away her remaining illusions of authority. She needed my signature to save her crumbling estate, and her passive-aggressive tactics were proving useless against my newfound composure. This realization didn't calm her. It only magnified her terror, driving her toward a much larger, more volatile stage. If she couldn't break me in the quiet intimacy of a dressing room, she would attempt to burn my entire future to the ground under the brightest lights she could find. The failure at the bridal boutique left Caroline with a rapidly shrinking window of opportunity. The wedding invitations were printed, the venue was secured, and the manila folder containing my financial surrender remained locked inside my desk drawer. With every passing day, my 25th birthday and my impending marriage drew closer, threatening to sever her access to the only solvent asset the Jade family had left. She needed the wedding canceled. If the nuptials did not occur, the trust would not vest, granting her the time she required to break my resolve and force my signature. This desperation brings us back to the French chandelier, the silver oyster forks, and the engagement dinner where Caroline finally overplayed her hand, betting everything on a single venomous strike. The Rutledge estate sits south of Broad Street, guarded by wrought iron gates and ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss. Entering their home felt like stepping into a private museum, a stark contrast to the performative, strained elegance of my own childhood residence. The dining room walls were covered in hand-painted silk wallpaper, and the mahogany table stretched long enough to seat 20 guests comfortably. We were a much smaller, more intimate party that evening, illuminated by the warm, glittering light of the antique crystal overhead. Weston sat to my right, his presence a steady, reassuring anchor in a room that otherwise felt like a tribunal. Victoria occupied the head of the table, radiating the kind of effortless, terrifying authority that cannot be bought or borrowed. Caroline and Savannah sat across from me, looking visibly strained despite their designer evening wear. Throughout the first 3 courses of the meal, Caroline drank her wine with an alarming focused urgency. Her usual polished chatter felt disjointed, her laughter slightly too loud. I recognized the signs immediately. Growing up, this frantic energy always preceded a targeted cruelty. She was winding herself up, preparing to deploy a weapon she believed would guarantee my ruin. In her mind, the Rutledge family prized their immaculate lineage above all else. She calculated that if she exposed my origins in the harshest, most unrefined terms possible, their aristocratic sensibilities would override their affection for me. They would view me as a genetic liability, a stray variable that had somehow wandered into their pedigree kennel, and they would swiftly end the engagement to protect their bloodline. The roasted quail had just been cleared by the silent waitstaff when Caroline reached for her champagne flute. She tapped her sterling silver spoon against the delicate crystal rim, the sharp chime cutting through the soft hum of conversation. The table quieted instantly. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the fine white linen, her eyes locking onto Victoria. Her tone was dripping with saccharine concern, a weaponized southern drawl designed to inflict maximum damage under the thin, plausible guise of maternal transparency. "We just want you to know her background," Caroline sighed, waving a dismissive manicured hand across the table toward me. "Bianca was a charity adoption from a rather unfortunate area. She isn't really one of us, and we would just hate for her roots to embarrass your family down the line." The oxygen vanished from the room. The silence that followed was not merely quiet, it was heavy, suffocating, and profound. Savannah raised her crystal water goblet to hide a triumphant smirk, convinced that our mother had just executed the perfect social checkmate. Savannah had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate her own stature, and she clearly believed this was the moment I would be permanently banished from her elevated sphere. I stared down at the intricate floral pattern on my porcelain bread plate, my hands trembling in my lap. For 18 years, my survival strategy had been to freeze whenever Caroline went on the offensive. I braced for the inevitable familiar sting of rejection, waiting for Victoria to offer a polite, devastating excuse to end the evening early. I prepared myself for the quiet ride home, signaling the end of my relationship with Weston and a return to my role as the unpaid estate manager. Instead, the matriarch of the Rutledge family moved with deliberate, terrifying calm. Victoria set down her oyster fork. The soft clink of the silver against her plate echoed like a gunshot in the silent dining room. She pushed her chair back, rising to her feet with fluid, unhurried grace. She did not raise her voice. She did not exhibit a single trace of outrage. She simply leveled a gaze at my adoptive mother that carried the freezing weight of an Arctic winter. "She belongs here," Victoria stated, her enunciation razor-sharp and unyielding. "You clearly do not." Caroline's triumphant expression faltered, replaced by a flash of genuine confusion. She had expected a conspiratorial alliance based on class solidarity. She had anticipated a shared grimace over the unfortunate reality of my genetics. She had not anticipated becoming the target of Victoria's disdain. Victoria did not grant her a single moment to recover or offer a defense. She turned her head slightly toward the periphery of the dining room, where her household staff stood in discreet attendance. "Thomas?" Victoria addressed her head butler, her tone conversational, but brooking zero negotiation. "Mrs. Jade and Savannah are feeling unwell. Please escort them to their vehicle immediately." The color drained from Caroline's face, leaving her a sickly, chalky white. To be politely ejected from a dinner party in Charleston is a staggering humiliation. It is a social death sentence delivered with a serene smile. Her jaw dropped, and the polished philanthropic veneer finally shattered. "You cannot be serious," Caroline sputtered, her voice rising to a shrill, undignified pitch, her hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table. "I am her mother. You cannot speak to me this way." Victoria remained standing, her posture straight and uncompromising. "You are a guest in my home who has forgotten her manners," she replied, dropping the temperature of her voice another 10 degrees, making the room feel genuinely cold. "Leave." The finality of the command stripped the air right out of Caroline's lungs. Savannah, realizing the magnitude of the disaster, dropped her smirk. Her eyes welled with frantic hot tears as she pushed her chair back, the harsh scrape of the wood betraying her escalating panic. The biological golden child, accustomed to universal adoration and effortless passes, fled toward the grand foyer with her head bowed, unable to withstand the sheer, crushing weight of Victoria's disapproval. Caroline was left alone at the table, clutching her designer handbag, her social execution complete. She stumbled as she stood, her composure in ruins. She did not offer an apology, nor could she muster a parting retort. Stripped of her leverage and exposed as a petty, desperate tyrant in front of the very people she sought to impress, she turned and followed her daughter out of the dining room. They were escorted by a silent, uncompromising butler whose mere presence ensured they would not linger. A moment later, the heavy front door thudded shut, sealing them outside in the humid night air. I sat perfectly still in my chair, unable to process the swift, brutal justice that had just occurred. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The conditioned fear of my childhood screamed that I was somehow responsible for the ugly scene that Weston would now view me as a source of endless, exhausting drama. I slowly turned my head to look at him, waiting to see the inevitable exhaustion in his eyes, waiting for the polite distancing to begin. Weston did not look disgusted. He did not pull his hand away from mine. He reached across the small expanse of table between us, picked up a silver serving spoon, and offered a warm, untroubled smile that smoothed the frantic edges of my panic. He leaned in, kissed my cheek with tender reassurance, and gestured toward a crystal bowl sitting near the elaborate floral centerpiece. "Would you like the rest of the crab dip?" he asked, his voice steady, grounding, and entirely devoid of pity. The tension drained out of my spine, replaced by a surreal, euphoric relief. I nodded, allowing him to serve a generous portion onto my plate. The engagement dinner resumed its quiet elegance, absent the toxic, suffocating weight of the Jade women. But as I tasted the rich, seasoned crab, a new realization crystallized in my mind. Caroline had just burned her final bridge. She had exhausted her social leverage, alienated the most powerful family in the city, and failed to halt the wedding timeline. A cornered animal does not retreat. It fights with whatever teeth it has left. By morning, the battle over my signature would transition from passive-aggressive dining room theater to a ruthless forensic war, and I needed to prepare myself for the fallout. I woke up the following morning before the sun managed to crest the wrought iron balconies of the Rutledge estate. The guest room was a masterpiece of muted tones and plush fabrics, yet my body remained rigid beneath the heavy linen duvet. I lay there staring at the intricate plaster molding on the ceiling, waiting for the inevitable knock on the door. My mind raced through the conditioned pathways of my upbringing. Caroline had caused a scene of unparalleled vulgarity, and logic dictated that the collateral damage would include me. I fully expected a polite, devastating conversation over breakfast. I anticipated a gentle, sympathetic suggestion that Weston and I postpone the wedding until my family matters were resolved, which was the polite Southern translation for calling off the engagement entirely to protect the Rutledge reputation from the Jade family circus. Instead, a quiet maid slipped a handwritten note under my door at 8 o'clock. It was penned on thick cream-colored stationery, inviting me to join Victoria for morning coffee in the conservatory. There was no mention of the previous evening, no subtle undertone of crisis. I dressed quickly, selecting a simple tailored blouse and trousers, bracing myself for the polite dismissal I felt certain was coming. I navigated the quiet corridors of the house, my footsteps muffled by thick Persian runners, until I reached the glass-walled sunroom at the rear of the property. The conservatory was a humid, fragrant sanctuary, filled with towering Boston ferns, blooming orchids, and the rich, earthy scent of damp potting soil. Sunlight filtered through the glass panes, casting long geometric shadows across the terracotta floor tiles. Victoria stood near a polished marble counter, operating a gleaming chrome espresso machine. She wore a casual cashmere sweater and pearl stud earrings, looking entirely unbothered by the catastrophic dinner party that had unfolded mere hours prior. She did not offer a pitying smile or a heavy sigh when I entered. She simply handed me a demitasse cup, the porcelain hot against my palms. We sat in a pair of wicker chairs overlooking the manicured gardens. Victoria took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee, her gaze fixed on a cluster of white hydrangeas outside the glass. The silence stretched, comfortable for her, agonizing for me. Finally, she turned her head and looked at me with an expression of crystalline clarity. Bianca Victoria began, her voice possessing the calm, steady cadence of a woman who has navigated decades of social warfare. In the South, we do not scream at our enemies. We do not throw tantrums over dinner or hurl insults across a table. We simply change the locks. She paused, allowing the gravity of the statement to settle between us. She set her cup down on a glass-top table with a quiet click. "Your mother is hiding something massive," Victoria continued, her eyes locking onto mine, stripping away years of my internalized doubt. "Women like Caroline J. do not act with such vulgar desperation unless they are out of money or out of time. Yesterday evening was not a display of strength or superiority. It was the frantic flailing of a person who has lost control of her own survival. She attempted to humiliate you because you hold something she desperately requires, and she is terrified that you are slipping beyond her reach." I sat frozen in the wicker chair, the hot espresso turning bitter on my tongue as her words resonated deep inside my chest. She was right. Every erratic behavior, every sudden cruelty, the frantic demand for my signature on that trust document, all of it pointed toward a structural collapse. The baseline conflict of my life, the emotional abuse, and the relentless extraction of my usefulness had shifted entirely into a high-stakes financial war. Caroline did not view me as a daughter to be managed anymore. She viewed me as a fleeing asset. Victoria reached across the space between us and placed her hand over mine, her grip firm and grounding. She did not offer me sympathy. She offered me validation, which was infinitely more valuable. For 22 years, I had accepted the narrative that I was a flawed, inadequate charity case who owed the Jade family a lifetime of subservient gratitude. In a single morning sitting among the orchids, that narrative evaporated. I stopped being the quiet, compliant scapegoat. The heavy, invisible yoke I had carried since childhood fell away, leaving behind a sharp, cold clarity. I finished my espresso and stood up. I did not feel fear anymore. I felt the precise, focused energy of an appraiser who has just spotted a critical flaw in a supposedly priceless artifact. I thanked Victoria for the coffee and for her absolute, unyielding honesty. When I walked out of the conservatory and found Weston waiting for me in the main hallway, I did not ask for his reassurance. I asked for his resources. Weston understood the shift in my demeanor instantly. He did not push for details of the conversation. He simply recognized that the defensive phase of my life had concluded. I told him about the manila folder Caroline had delivered to my home office, the sweeping amendment designed to transfer my protected trust into her discretionary control. I explained my suspicion that the document was the linchpin to a much larger, darker reality. Weston nodded, his expression hardening into a look of fierce, protective determination. He pulled out his phone and bypassed his usual contacts, reaching directly for a name reserved for severe, complex disputes. He recommended a forensic estate attorney located in a discreet office building near the Battery, a man renowned for dismantling fraudulent financial structures with surgical precision. I returned to my home office later that afternoon, stepping into the converted sunroom with a fresh perspective. The house was quiet, likely because Caroline was nursing a tremendous headache and the sting of her unprecedented social exile. I bypassed my drafting table, walked straight to my locked filing cabinet, and retrieved the thick manila folder. The heavy cardstock felt different in my hands now. It was no longer a symbol of my mother's intimidation. It was a piece of evidence. I carried the folder out to my car and drove straight to the address Weston had provided. The law firm did not feature flashy signage or sweeping glass facades. It was housed in a historic brick building radiating an aura of severe, expensive discretion. I sat across from the attorney, a man with sharp eyes and a quiet demeanor, and slid the unexecuted trust amendment across his mahogany desk. I was not just going to refuse to sign the paperwork. Refusal was a passive act, and passive acts would not protect me from the ensuing fallout. I instructed the attorney to execute a comprehensive forensic audit of the entire Jade family estate. I needed to know the exact status of William's original trusts, the current balances, the outstanding liabilities, and the precise trajectory of Caroline's spending over the past 5 years. I was going to find out exactly why my signature was the only thing standing between my adoptive mother and total ruin. I walked out of the law office and back into the humid Charleston afternoon with my spine straight and my vision clear. The era of my blind obedience was officially over. I was no longer the grateful orphan willing to absorb punishment for the sake of peace. I had authorized an investigation that would strip the veneer off the Jade family legacy, and I knew the numbers would reveal a truth far uglier than anything Caroline had ever accused me of being. The trap had been set, but she had no idea the jaws were about to snap shut on her instead. The wait required 3 days. I spent those 72 hours maintaining a schedule of punishing normalcy. I appraised a collection of Depression-era glass for a client in Mount Pleasant, cataloged antique textiles, and drank my morning coffee in the kitchen while Caroline paced the adjacent hallway. Her composure was disintegrating rapidly. She snapped at the household staff, her voice sharp and frayed, while Savannah spent her afternoons crying over perceived slights from her social circle. They felt the ground shifting beneath them, though they did not yet understand I was the one holding the geological survey. On Thursday afternoon, my phone rang. The forensic estate attorney requested my presence at his office near the Battery. When I arrived, the heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, sealing out the humid Charleston heat. The attorney, Mr. Caldwell, sat behind an expansive mahogany desk. He did not offer a polite smile or ask about my wedding preparations. He simply gestured to the leather chair opposite him. Spread across the polished wood surface lay a half-dozen thick binders, financial ledgers, and printed banking statements. It looked less like an estate review and more like the anatomy of a slow, deliberate disaster. He folded his hands and delivered his findings with the clinical detachment of a coroner determining a cause of death. The results of the audit were a masterpiece of financial delusion. My adoptive father, William, had been a prudent man who understood the corrosive nature of the society his wife worshipped. Upon his passing, he left behind a substantial, exceptionally well-managed estate. He divided his assets into 3 distinct trusts, one for Caroline, one for Savannah, and one for me. Because I was adopted, and because William possessed a profound understanding of how Caroline viewed my place in the hierarchy, he installed ironclad stipulations on my specific portion. He constructed a legal fortress around my inheritance to ensure Caroline could never access the principal or the generated interest. The terms dictated that my trust would remain sealed under the management of an independent fiduciary until I reached my 25th birthday, or upon the legal registration of my marriage. Whichever milestone occurred first would trigger the release of the funds directly into my control. Mr. Caldwell opened the first binder. It contained the history of Caroline's personal trust over the past 5 years. She had treated William's carefully accumulated wealth like an infinite reservoir. In her bid to maintain the illusion of low-country aristocratic supremacy, she drained her own accounts with breathtaking speed. She paid exorbitant annual dues at the most exclusive country clubs to ensure her name remained on the primary social registries. She funded weeks-long European vacations, purchased purchasing first-class airfare and booking luxury suites in Paris and Milan, returning with designer wardrobes she paraded at local charity galas. She covered Savannah's revolving credit card bills, financing a lifestyle of imported silk fine dining and endless cosmetic enhancements. Caroline burned through millions of dollars to convince a circle of judgmental peers that the Jade family remained at the pinnacle of the social ladder. By year 4, Caroline had depleted her own reserves. Her trust was functionally empty. But the facade required constant funding, and Caroline was not a woman who knew how to retreat. Mr. Caldwell slid a second binder toward me, his expression darkening. This is where the mismanagement transitioned from simple negligence into actionable fraud. Having exhausted her own resources, Caroline turned her attention to Savannah's trust. Savannah, willfully ignorant of anything involving mathematics or accountability, had blindly signed whatever documents her mother placed in front of her. Caroline leveraged Savannah's future assets to secure a series of high-interest loans. She used her biological daughter's inheritance as collateral to maintain their decaying empire. The gamble failed. The interest rates compounded, the principal payments ballooned, and the lifestyle did not change. According to the documents resting on the mahogany desk, those loans were currently in default. The creditors were circling. Caroline and Savannah were insolvent. They were hopelessly bankrupt. I sat in the leather chair, staring at the columns of red ink illuminating the pages. The silence in the office was profound. I traced the edge of the open binder with my index finger, absorbing the magnitude of the betrayal. Then Mr. Caldwell opened the third and final binder. It contained the records of my trust. Untouched, protected, solvent. Growing quietly under the careful stewardship of the independent fiduciary my inheritance represented. The final remaining asset tied to the Jade family name. It was a substantial sum, more than enough to clear the defaulting loans and stabilize the estate. The true motive behind the manila folder Caroline had shoved across my desk finally crystallized. The puzzle pieces snapped into place, revealing a picture of staggering desperation. The sweeping amendment she demanded I sign was not a mere administrative shortcut for a fender bender. It was a lifeline. She needed my signature to break the legal seal William had placed on my accounts. She intended to siphon my inheritance to pay off the fraudulent loans she had taken out against Savannah's trust, effectively sacrificing my future to hide her crimes. The urgency surrounding my engagement was now glaringly obvious. The protective stipulations of my trust stated that the funds would vest upon my marriage. The moment I stood at an altar and exchanged vows with Weston Rutledge, the money would legally lock into a private account that Caroline could never access. Once that transfer occurred, the creditors would move in and the bank would initiate foreclosure proceedings on the historic Jade family home. She would lose the property, the address, and the only remaining symbol of her status. Caroline did not merely want my money. She required it to survive. She needed to absorb my entire identity, to strip mine my resources just to maintain the fiction of her own superiority. The irony of the situation struck me with the force of a physical blow. Just days prior, under the glittering light of an antique French chandelier, she had publicly degraded me. She told the wealthiest family in the city that I was a charity case, an unfortunate girl from a bad area, an embarrassment to her refined sensibilities. She called me trash in a frantic attempt to sever my relationship and halt the wedding timeline. Yet the trash she so publicly despised was the only thing keeping a roof over her head. I looked up from the financial ledgers. I felt a profound sense of calm settle over my nervous system. For 22 years, I had navigated my life believing I was a burden, an unwanted stray existing on the margins of their golden world. I had endured the subtle cruelties and the overt humiliations because I thought I owed them a debt of gratitude for my rescue. Now I held the documentary proof that they were the parasites. They were hollow, decaying structures relying entirely on my compliance to keep from collapsing into dust. I thanked Mr. Caldwell for his thorough work. I asked him for a set of certified copies of the ledgers, the default notices, and the fraudulent loan agreements. I placed the documents carefully into my leather portfolio, feeling the satisfying weight of undeniable leverage. I walked out of the law office and stepped into the bright, humid Charleston afternoon. The power dynamic had inverted. Caroline believed she was a predator cornering a weak, submissive prey, but she had misjudged the terrain. I knew her secrets. I held the keys to her survival, and I had no intention of unlocking the door. As I drove back toward my own apartment, skipping the Jade estate entirely, I devised a new strategy. I would not confront her. I would not yell or demand an apology. I would weaponize my absence. I would let her sit in the suffocating silence of her own impending ruin, watching the clock tick down toward a wedding she could not stop. When you discover that the people who have spent 2 decades abusing you are entirely dependent upon your compliance for their very survival, the power dynamic shifts with the speed of a falling guillotine. I returned to my apartment that evening, locked the deadbolt, and placed the leather portfolio containing the forensic audit onto my kitchen island. For years, I had operated under the assumption that I was the fragile, disposable component of the Jade family machine. I believed my adoptive mother held all the leverage, dispensing shelter and conditional affection while requiring my endless labor as rent. The ledgers proved otherwise. Caroline and Savannah were empty vessels, hollowed out by their own vanity, relying on my inheritance to plug the sinking hull of their lifestyle. Once that truth settled in my mind, the lingering fear evaporated. Weston and I spent that weekend constructing a defense mechanism built on pure, agonizing silence. Silence is the one weapon a manipulator cannot counter. Caroline thrived on friction. She utilized arguments the way a fire utilizes oxygen, twisting every defensive response into fresh fuel for her victim narrative. If I engaged or answered her calls, or tried to rationally explain why I refused to sign the trust amendment, she would twist my words and drag me back into the familiar, suffocating cycle of guilt. Therefore, I offered her nothing. I became a vault. The digital assault began early Monday morning. My phone vibrated across the marble countertop, illuminating with a rapid succession of texts from Caroline. The tone of her messages charted a predictable, feverish trajectory. She started with brisk maternal authority, instructing me to bring the signed paperwork to the historic house before noon. When noon passed without a response, the messages shifted into sharp annoyance, reprimanding me for my lack of respect. By Tuesday evening, the authority had curdled into outright dread. Her texts devolved into long, erratic paragraphs, accusing me of destroying our legacy and begging me to remember who put clothes on my back. I read every single syllable. I did not type a single reply. Savannah proved even less equipped to handle the deprivation of attention. The biological golden child of the Jade household had never experienced a boundary she could not simply cry her way through. My voicemail inbox filled with her tearful, breathless audio messages. I would sit on my sofa, listening to her voice waver as she pleaded with me to surrender. She did not ask why I was hesitating. She did not express concern for my well-being. Her pleas were entirely self-centered, focused only on her immediate discomfort. "Bianca, you are ruining everything," Savannah sobbed on a Wednesday afternoon, recording her voice thick with congestion. "Just sign the paper so Mom stops crying. The house is a nightmare right now. You are being so incredibly selfish, and I cannot deal with the stress you are causing us." Savannah viewed my financial execution merely as a convenient method to restore her comfortable status quo. She did not care that the amendment would strip me of my independence. She only cared that Caroline was ruining her week with incessant pacing and shouting. I saved the audio files into a dedicated folder on my computer. I did not call her back. I maintained a routine of punishing normalcy. I woke up dressed in my tailored professional attire and went to work at the appraisal firm every single day. I focused my energy on authenticating 19th century estate jewelry and evaluating antique mahogany furniture. The quiet, methodical nature of my profession offered a profound refuge. An antique requires careful observation, but it never demands an apology. I found peace in the predictable weight of silver and the honest grain of old wood. I was perfectly calm, anchored by the indisputable facts resting inside my leather portfolio. Caroline, however, was rapidly losing her grip on reality. Denied her usual avenues of control, she escalated her tactics, bringing the battle into my professional sphere. On Thursday morning, she marched through the glass doors of my appraisal firm, radiating a brittle, chaotic energy. She bypassed the waiting area and approached the front desk, expecting the waters to part for her as they always did in Charleston society. I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room evaluating a collection of cameo brooches, and I watched the scene unfold with clinical detachment. Caroline slapped her hand on the reception counter, demanding to see me immediately. She wore a designer silk blouse, but her hair was unkempt and her posture betrayed a frantic urgency. Our receptionist, a formidable woman named Miriam, who had managed the front office for 2 decades, did not flinch. I had briefed Miriam earlier in the week, instructing her to block any unscheduled visits from my family members. Miriam looked up from her computer monitor, adjusting her reading glasses, and informed Caroline in a flat, polite tone that I was occupied in back-to-back client meetings and could not be disturbed. I watched Caroline's face flush with indignation. She pointed a trembling finger toward the hallway where I sat, insisting that she was my mother and required instant access. Miriam simply picked up her telephone, her hand hovering over the dial pad, and offered to summon building security to assist Caroline back to her vehicle. The threat of a public disturbance, the very thing Caroline had spent her life avoiding, finally penetrated her panic. She glared at the reception desk, her jaw rigid, before turning on her heel and storming out of the lobby. I remained in the conference room, my pulse steady. I had watched her hit a solid boundary, and the boundary held firm. The tension in the air was thick enough to carve, but I held the line. By denying them the dramatic confrontation they craved, I forced them to sit in their own escalating terror. They were drowning in a sea of defaulted loans and unpaid country club dues, and they knew I was standing securely on the shore. I was holding the only life preserver, and I was actively refusing to throw it. The realization that they could no longer manipulate me was tearing the fabric of their reality apart. It was Savannah who eventually cracked under the pressure. Deprived of my compliance and trapped in a house with a mother spiraling into financial ruin, Savannah's fragile coping mechanisms shattered. On Friday evening, my phone screen illuminated with a notification. It was a sprawling, unhinged group text message. Savannah had added every aunt, uncle, and prominent cousin in our extended family network to the thread. I opened the message and read the frantic block of text. Savannah abandoned all pretense of Southern decorum. She accused me of orchestrating a malicious plot to destroy the Jade legacy. She claimed I was hoarding millions of dollars, intentionally stealing her rightful inheritance through a legal loophole, and abandoning the family in our darkest hour of need. She painted a picture of a cruel, calculating orphan who had taken advantage of their boundless charity, only to turn around and evict them from their ancestral home the moment I secured a wealthy fiancé. She begged the extended family to intervene, to talk some sense into me before the bank finalized the foreclosure and ruined their impeccable standing in the community. The group chat remained eerily silent. The extended family, accustomed to Caroline's polished veneer, was likely staring at their screens in stunned disbelief, unable to process the sheer vulgarity of Savannah's public meltdown. The old version of Bianca would have rushed to contain the damage. I would have drafted a dozen replies trying to defend my character, trying to explain the forensic audit, trying to salvage my reputation in the eyes of relatives who had never truly accepted me anyway. I did none of those things. I did not type a single letter in defense. I did not offer a rebuttal or an explanation to the extended family. I simply pressed the side buttons on my phone, capturing a clean, high-resolution screenshot of every single word Savannah had typed. I scrolled down, captured the rest of the message, and saved the images. I transferred the files into a secure digital folder, adding them to my growing arsenal of receipts. Savannah thought she was destroying my character, but she was merely providing me with documented proof of their extortionate mindset. The trap was fully set, and their erratic behavior was only tightening the snare. I placed my phone face down on the kitchen island, poured myself a glass of water, and prepared for the inevitable moment when Caroline would bypass the digital warfare and ambush me in the physical world. Cornered animals bite. This is a fundamental law of nature that applies equally to the feral creatures hiding deep within the Carolina marshlands and the desperate socialites clinging to the edges of the low-country aristocracy. When deprived of an escape route, a predator will abandon all strategic elegance and rely purely on primal instinct. Caroline had spent her entire adult life curating an image of effortless superiority. She cultivated the persona of a refined, untouchable matriarch who managed her household and her philanthropic duties with a serene, unbothered grace. But as the clock ticked steadily down toward the rehearsal dinner, her avenues of manipulation evaporated. The silence I maintained over the past several days acted as a relentless vice tightening around her fragile reality with every unanswered text message and ignored phone call. With only 1 week remaining until the wedding, she realized the polite avenues of coercion were permanently sealed. She had to strike directly, and she had to strike with enough force to shatter my newfound resolve. It was late Tuesday evening. The oppressive summer humidity hung thick in the air, wrapping around the historic district like a damp wool blanket. I finished a long, demanding day at the appraisal firm, meticulously cataloging a collection of Victorian mourning jewelry for a private estate sale. My eyes ached from staring through the jeweler's loop, and I desired nothing more than the quiet sanctuary of my own living space. I drove back to my apartment complex, a modern building located just outside the cobblestone limits of the old city. The parking lot was poorly lit, illuminated only by the flickering amber glow of a few scattered street lamps, casting long shadows across the asphalt. I parked my vehicle, turned off the engine, and gathered my leather portfolio from the passenger seat, my mind focused entirely on finalizing the upcoming floral arrangements and coordinating the catering schedules with Weston. I did not expect an ambush. I assumed Caroline was too busy managing the chaotic fallout of Savannah's disastrous group message to leave the confines of her decaying estate. I believed the sheer humiliation of her social standing would keep her contained behind her heavy mahogany doors. As I locked my car door, the distinct, sharp click of a designer heel echoed against the pavement. A shadow detached itself from the side of the brick building, moving rapidly into the halo of the street lamp. I turned, tightening my grip on my portfolio, and found my adoptive mother blocking the narrow path to my stairwell. The sight of her sent a momentary jolt of adrenaline through my veins, not out of fear, but out of sheer astonishment at her physical deterioration. The immaculate, refined Southern belle was gone, replaced by a specter of impending ruin. In her place stood a woman unspooling at the seams. Her expensive trench coat looked rumpled, thrown hastily over her shoulders without care. Her usually pristine blonde hair hung flat, escaping its expensive pins in messy, damp strands that stuck to her forehead. The delicate lines around her mouth had deepened into harsh, bitter grooves, and her eyes held a frantic, feral gleam. She looked haggard. She looked vicious. She looked exactly like a woman who had spent the last 96 hours staring into the terrifying abyss of her own bankruptcy. Before I could utter a single greeting or question her presence, she lunged forward, closing the distance between us in 2 rapid strides. She thrust a thick, heavy envelope forward, shoving the stiff paper directly against my chest. The sudden impact forced me to take a half-step backward to maintain my physical balance. "If you do not sign the trust amendment by Friday," Caroline hissed, her voice a ragged, breathless whisper that carried no trace of her usual aristocratic drawl, "I am taking this directly to the Charleston Society blogs, every single one of them. I will distribute copies to the Country Club Board, the Preservation Society, and the local newspapers." I looked down at the thick envelope pressed against my blouse. It bore the heavy embossed seal of the state family court system, a faded crest indicating highly confidential files. My stomach tightened. For a fraction of a second, the terrified 4-year-old girl inside me stirred, anticipating the pain of rejection. Caroline saw that brief flicker of recognition in my eyes and pressed her perceived advantage her lips, curling into a triumphant, ugly sneer. "I have your sealed adoption records," she spat, tapping a manicured fingernail against the heavy paper with rhythmic cruelty. "I know exactly who your real parents were, Bianca. I have always known, and I kept it buried to protect our reputation. They were not tragic victims of circumstance or noble people down on their luck. They were addicts. They were convicted criminals who spent their lives rotating in and out of the county jail system. They were the lowest tier of society, a pair of useless grifters, and their blood is running straight through your veins." She stepped closer, invading my personal space, radiating the sharp, sour scent of stale gin and cold sweat. "I will publish every dirty detail of your genetics. I will release the arrest records, the court transcripts, the termination of parental rights. The entire city will know exactly what kind of pedigree Weston is marrying into." The The Rutledge family prizes their lineage above all else. They trace their ancestry back to the founding of this state. Do you honestly believe Victoria will allow her son to taint their pristine bloodline with the offspring of felons? They will drop you so fast your head will spin. Your engagement will be over before the ink on the blog posts even dries. You will be a social pariah, a laughingstock, and you will have nothing left. It was extortion, plain and simple. She was threatening to burn my future to the ground, to incinerate my happiness and my upcoming marriage if I refused to hand over my inheritance. She had calculated that the deep-seated shame of my origins would be the one vulnerability I could not protect. In her shallow worldview, social standing was the only currency that mattered, and the threat of public disgrace was the ultimate weapon. She expected me to crumble. She stood there on the damp asphalt, her chest heaving with exertion, waiting for the inevitable emotional breakdown. She anticipated hot tears streaming down my face. She wanted me to beg for mercy, to plead with her to keep the record sealed and my secret safe. She needed me to break, to finally concede that I was nothing without her protection, and to offer my signature on the trust amendment in exchange for her permanent silence. Yet standing under the flickering amber street lamp, I felt a profound, chilling detachment settle over my mind. A few months ago, prior to my engagement, this revelation might have shattered me into 1,000 pieces. I had spent my childhood wondering why I was discarded by my birth family, fearing that some inherent invisible flaw made me unlovable. But the woman holding the envelope was bankrupt, desperate, and entirely devoid of any moral authority. I had spent the past week analyzing the forensic audit of her financial crimes. I knew she had illegally leveraged her own biological daughter's future to fund a country club membership and a closet full of designer dresses. The concept of her judging my birth parents for their flaws struck me as deeply, painfully ironic. My biological parents might have battled addiction and lost to their demons, but the woman standing in front of me had chosen her cruelty while sober, calculating every theft with a clear mind. Furthermore, she fundamentally misunderstood the people she was trying to manipulate. Victoria Rutledge had already looked me in the eye and assured me I belonged in their world. The Rutledge family valued personal integrity and fierce loyalty over the fragile illusion of perfection. A leaked court document detailing the sins of strangers would not destroy my relationship with Weston. It would only cement the Rutledge family's disgust for the woman leaking it. Caroline was holding a weapon that had no ammunition. I did not cry. I did not raise my hands to defend myself or attempt to snatch the documents away from her. I simply relaxed my shoulders and let the envelope slide down my chest. It fell through the humid air and landed flat on the pavement, the heavy paper making a soft thud near her expensive scuffed leather heels. I looked down at the discarded records resting in the dirt, and then I slowly lifted my gaze to meet her frantic, bloodshot eyes. I let a long, suffocating silence stretch between us, allowing her to feel the total echoing absence of my fear. I did not offer her the friction she craved. "Are you done?" I asked quietly, keeping my tone as even and unbothered as if I were asking for the time of day. The 3 words hung in the muggy air, carrying no anger, no panic, and zero willingness to negotiate. Caroline blinked, her mouth falling open slightly. The lack of emotion in my voice derailed her entire rehearsed script. She had prepared for a vicious fight, for a desperate negotiation, for a sobbing surrender. She had no defense against profound, unwavering apathy. The feral energy drained out of her posture in an instant, replaced by a sudden, jarring confusion. She stared at me, her eyes darting across my face, trying to locate the frightened little girl she used to control, unable to comprehend the strong, immovable woman who had taken her place. I turned away from her, retrieved my keys from my pocket, and pressed the unlock button on my fob. The headlights flashed, cutting through the shadows of the parking lot. I opened my car door, slid into the driver's seat, and pulled the door shut with a solid, definitive click. I engaged the internal locks, sealing myself inside the quiet cabin. Through the driver's side window, I watched her, standing alone in the parking lot. She looked down at the envelope lying on the asphalt, then back up at my vehicle, her shoulders slumping heavily under the crushing weight of her failed ambush. I started the engine, shifted into drive, and steered my car toward the exit, leaving her standing alone in the dark. The extortion attempt had failed, and in her desperation, she had handed me the final confirmation I needed. The battle for my compliance was over, and all that remained was setting the stage for the final reckoning. Savannah Jade possessed an extraordinary talent for constructing her own tragedy, provided there was a captive audience available to witness the performance. Raised to believe that her personal discomfort constituted a crisis requiring immediate public intervention, she could not endure the suffocating pressure of her family's impending bankruptcy in silence. Tuesday afternoon, while her mother was busy ambushing me in a humid parking lot, Savannah retreated to the one location she felt truly secure. She sought refuge on the shaded, breezy veranda of the Charleston Country Club, seeking the soothing balm of aristocratic sympathy. She settled into a wrought iron chair overlooking the manicured croquet lawns, ordered a tall glass of sweet iced tea, dabbed her eyes with a monogrammed linen napkin, and began to complain to the woman seated at the adjacent table. Savannah wept about the crushing injustice of her current situation. She detailed how a heartless, predatory bank was threatening to foreclose on her beloved childhood home. She bemoaned the cruel irony that her adopted sister was sitting on a vast fortune, hoarding millions of dollars, while her true family faced the humiliation of eviction. She laid out the entire financial rot of the Jade estate, assuming she was speaking to a sympathetic ear who would coddle her wounded pride and validate her victimhood. She failed to recognize that the woman sipping lemonade next to her was Genevieve DuPont. Genevieve was a fixture in the local preservation societies, but more importantly, she was a woman whose loyalty belonged exclusively to Victoria Rutledge. Genevieve did not offer Savannah a comforting hug or a word of pity. She listened intently, committed every frantic admission to memory, excused herself to the powder room, and dialed Victoria's private number. The scandalous gossip traversed the length of the city within a single hour, stripping away the last remaining layer of plausible deniability the Jade women possessed. What Caroline did not comprehend was that her biological daughter had already provided the final nail for their collective coffin. By the time I walked through the door of Weston's townhome that evening, leaving the discarded adoption records on the asphalt behind me, the Rutledge family network was already mobilizing. I found Weston standing in his study, the phone pressed to his ear, his jaw set in a rigid line of quiet fury. I recounted the extortion attempt, detailing Caroline's threat to release my sealed background files to the local society blogs. Weston did not shout, nor did he punch a wall. He exhibited the cold, tactical precision of a man raised to protect his inner circle against any external threat. He ended his current call and immediately dialed the managing partner of his family's legal firm. Old money does not issue empty threats in poorly lit parking lots. They deploy retainers. Within 2 hours, a swift, lethal, legal counterstrike was drafted in a high-rise office downtown. The attorneys prepared a preemptive injunction detailing the catastrophic defamation lawsuits that would rain down upon Caroline if she dared to leak any sealed medical, legal, or adoption records. The drafted documents outlined financial penalties that would not merely ruin her current standing, but would ensure her future remained trapped in endless litigation. It was a legal chokehold, ready to be executed the moment she stepped out of line. Caroline believed she possessed a devastating secret weapon, entirely unaware that Weston had just positioned a legal sniper on the roof. With the legal perimeter secured, I retreated to the quiet solitude of my own dining room to prepare my portion of the defense. I opened my laptop and connected it to the wireless printer sitting on my credenza. The machine hummed to life, and I began the methodical process of extracting the truth from the digital ether. I spent the remainder of the evening assembling every piece of evidence I had gathered over the past few weeks. I produced the forensic audit provided by the estate attorney, ensuring the columns of red ink detailing the drained accounts and the fraudulent loans rendered in stark, undeniable color. I documented the frantic blackmailing text messages Caroline had sent me, time-stamped and unaltered, showcasing her rapid descent into madness. I generated hard copies of the long, unhinged group chat Savannah had blasted to our extended relatives, preserving her venomous accusations on premium white paper. Finally, I printed the bank's official default notices regarding the Jade family home, the ultimate proof of their insolvency. I gathered the warm pages from the output tray, organizing them with the same meticulous care I applied when authenticating a collection of rare historical manuscripts. I aligned the edges perfectly, separated the sections with crisp index tabs, and placed the entire stack into a sleek, dark brown leather-bound portfolio. The rich scent of the leather grounded my racing thoughts. I ran my hand over the smooth cover, feeling the dense physical weight of the paper inside. I was not just preparing for a wedding rehearsal. I was preparing for a comprehensive, unyielding audit of a lifetime of abuse. For 2 decades, they had controlled the narrative, painting me as the flawed charity case while they masqueraded as benevolent aristocrats. The portfolio, resting on my table, contained the empirical data required to permanently correct that fabricated ledger. The stage for this final reckoning was set for Friday night. The rehearsal dinner was scheduled to take place at the Carolina Yacht Club, a venue that represented the ultimate pinnacle of the society Caroline worshipped. It was an exclusive enclave overlooking the harbor, dripping with Spanish moss and old-world exclusivity, a place where entry was dictated strictly by lineage and wealth. It was the exact environment where my adoptive mother felt most powerful, surrounded by the wealthy peers she spent her entire life trying to impress. She had spent the week twisting in the wind, agonizing over my silence, but the upcoming dinner provided her with a false sense of security. She assumed the highly public nature of the event would work to her advantage. She thought she was walking into the yacht club to collect my terrified surrender, believing I would hand over my signature to prevent her from executing her parking lot threats in front of the Rutledge guests. She anticipated a quiet, weeping capitulation near the oyster bar, a silent transfer of wealth that would save her historic home and preserve her pristine facade. She had no idea she was walking directly onto a scaffold. The Carolina Yacht Club stands as a formidable monument to exclusivity, perched on the very edge of the harbor where the salty Atlantic breeze tangles with the heavy, humid air of the Low Country. Ancient live oaks draped in gray Spanish moss flank the entrance, creating a natural, sweeping canopy over the cobblestone drive. Inside, the architecture speaks of quiet generational power. The walls boast dark mahogany paneling, gleaming brass maritime fixtures, and stern oil portraits of past commodores watching over the dining hall. This building represents the absolute zenith of the social hierarchy Caroline worshipped. For her, crossing this threshold was akin to entering a sacred temple, a validation of the status she had spent decades trying to purchase. During my adolescence, Caroline only gained access to prestigious venues like this through peripheral charity committees. Whenever she managed to secure a coveted invitation, she would relegate me to the shadows. My assigned duty was usually standing near the cloakroom holding her spare wrap and Savannah's touch-up cosmetics, instructed to remain silent and out of sight. I was the utilitarian accessory, dragged along only to fulfill the public narrative of her boundless benevolence. Tonight, however, I was the guest of honor, and the shift in the atmospheric pressure was palpable. The room was packed with the most influential families in the state, senators conversing with shipping magnates, their laughter mingling with the clinking of fine crystal. The heavy double doors swung open, admitting the damp evening air alongside my adoptive mother and sister. They made their entrance with practiced, desperate theatricality. Both wore brand-new, breathtakingly expensive designer gowns. Savannah floated into the foyer in a cloud of blush silk organza, turning her head to ensure she captured the attention of the nearest attendees. Caroline opted for a structured emerald satin that caught the ambient light, her posture rigid with an aggressive sort of pride. A trained eye could appreciate the intricate tailoring, but my appraiser instincts registered the underlying reality. Those dresses were purchased on credit lines that were actively defaulting, a final reckless flex of phantom wealth. They were parading through the room, draped in unpaid invoices, performing a pantomime of aristocracy, while their estate crumbled into ruin. I stood near an elaborate raw bar, the crushed ice gleaming underneath silver trays of freshly shupped oysters and cocktail shrimp. My hands held the dark brown leather portfolio I had meticulously assembled the previous night. The supple leather felt warm against my palms, grounding my racing pulse. Inside that folder rested the forensic audit, the printed blackmail texts, and the bank foreclosure notices. It was a heavy, dense ledger of their sins. Caroline scanned the crowded room, her gaze sweeping past the local politicians until she located me standing by the ice sculpture. Her eyes immediately dropped to the portfolio in my hands. A predatory spark ignited in her pupils. She assumed the elegant folder contained her salvation, the signed trust amendment that would refill her empty coffers and rescue her from impending financial ruin. She glided across the parquet floor, leaving Savannah behind to secure a cocktail from a passing waiter. Caroline sidled up next to me, invading my personal space with the familiar, suffocating scent of her signature floral perfume, mixed with a sharp undertone of anxiety. She angled her body to block me from the view of the passing guests, maintaining a pristine, radiant smile for anyone who happened to glance our way. Beneath the veneer, her energy buzzed with toxic anticipation. She leaned in close, her voice dropping into a sickly sweet conspiratorial whisper designed to simulate affection. "I knew you would see reason, darling," she murmured, her tone dripping with a fabricated maternal warmth that made my skin crawl. "Hand it over, and we can forget this whole ugly mess. We can put the unpleasantness of this week behind us and focus on enjoying your lovely little party. You did the right thing for the family, Bianca. Now just give me the documents." The old Bianca, the terrified child who flinched at the sound of her footsteps in the hallway, would have wilted under the pressure of that whisper. I felt the phantom weight of 22 years pressing down on my shoulders in that instant. The years spent acting as the scapegoat, the quiet outsider, the charity case, reminded daily of her inherent lack of worth, surged to the forefront of my mind. Yet, standing beside the oyster bar, that weight no longer possessed the power to crush me. It felt brittle, ready to shatter into dust. I felt the undeniable titanium strength of a woman who finally comprehended her exact value, unmoored from the abusive conditions of her upbringing. I did not look at Caroline. Instead, I let my gaze travel across the crowded dining hall, assessing the positions of the key players on the board. A few feet away, Weston stood engaged in a seemingly casual conversation with a local appellate judge. He was not looking at the magistrate. His focus remained locked onto my interaction with Caroline, his posture alert, a silent sentinel ready to cross the room the moment I gave the slightest signal. I shifted my attention toward the grand limestone fireplace anchoring the far wall. Victoria Rutledge held court there, surrounded by a rapt audience of elite benefactors. She held a crystal tumbler of neat bourbon, sipping the amber liquid with unhurried, terrifying grace. She caught my eye across the expanse of the room and offered a slow, imperceptible nod. The trap was ready, the exits were secured, and the audience was fully assembled. I turned my attention back to the woman who had spent my entire life trying to shrink me into submission. I tightened my grip on the leather portfolio, ensuring she could see the distinct gold foil monogram stamped on the cover. I kept my expression perfectly serene, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a panicked reaction or a tearful apology. I was a vault, and she did not have the combination. "There is a toast coming," I told her softly, my voice level and betraying zero emotion, carrying just enough volume to rise above the ambient chatter of the room. "Let us wait until after the speeches." Caroline stared at the leather folder, her eyes gleaming with undisguised, ravenous greed. The corner of her mouth twitched upward into a genuine, victorious smile. In her mind, my request for a delay was simply the final face-saving hesitation of a defeated opponent wanting to preserve a shred of dignity before surrendering. She thought she had won the war. She reached out and patted my forearm, a gesture of hollow, triumphant affection, entirely unaware that the polished wooden floor beneath her emerald satin heels was about to give way, plunging her into an abyss from which she would never return. The clatter of silverware against fine china began to slow. The ambient hum of wealthy families exchanging pleasantries faded as the formal toasts commenced. Weston's father stood first, raising his glass to welcome me into their fold with genuine warmth, praising my work ethic and my intellect. He spoke of character and integrity values that felt foreign in the household where I was raised. When he sat down, to a round of heartfelt applause, the floor was open. Caroline could not resist a captive audience. The spotlight was her preferred narcotic, the only substance that temporarily numbed her deep insecurity. She married into William's historic lineage, yet she always harbored a secret terror that she did not truly belong. To compensate, she transformed herself into the ultimate philanthropic savior, using charity to purchase the respect her bloodline lacked. Tonight was meant to be her crowning achievement. She intended to play the benevolent matriarch one final time before secretly robbing me blind. She rose from her seat, smoothing the front of her emerald satin gown. She picked up a silver spoon and struck the side of her crystal water goblet. The sharp, clear ring commanded the attention of every guest in the dining hall. She walked to the center of the room, standing beneath a portrait of a stern 19th century naval officer, and adopted a posture of weary, graceful dignity. She smiled, allowing her eyes to glisten with carefully manufactured tears. "Raising a child who is not of your own blood is a unique journey," Caroline began, her voice projected perfectly to reach the furthest tables. She placed a hand over her heart. "When William and I brought Bianca into our home, she was just a frightened little girl from a very difficult background, a background we preferred to leave in the past." A collective intake of breath rustled through the room. It was a calculated, venomous narrative masked as maternal vulnerability. She was reminding the wealthiest families in the state that I was an outsider, a stray she had generously fed and clothed. "There were days when we wondered if our love would be enough to overcome her origins," Caroline continued, allowing a single tear to spill over her eyelashes. She dabbed it away with a lace handkerchief. "We poured every ounce of our resources into providing her with an environment of elegance and proper moral instruction. We taught her how to navigate a world she was never meant to inherit. Looking at her tonight, sitting next to a man of Weston's caliber, I am just so overwhelmed with pride. Our little charity project has blossomed into a lovely bride. We saved her, and now she is finally in a position to repay that debt of gratitude." It was a masterclass in covert narcissism. She insulted my genetics, elevated her own status, and publicly demanded my subservience, all while masquerading as a weeping, devoted mother. A wave of polite, confused applause washed over the yacht club. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Victoria Rutledge sat near the fireplace, swirling the amber liquid in her crystal tumbler, watching Caroline with the detached fascination of a predator observing a wounded bird. Weston sat beside me, his jaw locked, his eyes burning with a silent, ferocious anger. I placed my hand over his, offering a gentle squeeze to signal that I required no rescue. I had the ledger. Caroline basked in the applause, her chest rising and falling with triumphant satisfaction. She lowered her handkerchief and turned her gaze directly toward me. She stepped away from the center of the room and walked to my table. She stopped inches from my chair, the heavy scent of her floral perfume rolling over me. She extended her hand, palm up, waiting for her prize. Her eyes darted to the dark brown leather portfolio resting on my lap. She believed the folder contained the signed trust amendment, the legal instrument that would refill her empty bank accounts and save her from the encroaching foreclosure. I stood up. I smoothed the skirt of my dress and met her gaze. I did not shrink. I did not tremble. I picked up the leather-bound portfolio and held it out. Caroline snatched it from my hands with eager, undisguised greed. She could not wait until we returned to the privacy of her home. Her desperation demanded immediate relief. She flipped the heavy leather cover open right there on the parquet floor, standing in front of 180 elite guests. I watched the physical transformation occur in real time. The victorious, radiant smile froze on her face. Her eyes darted across the top page, searching for the familiar legal boilerplate and my signature on the dotted line. Instead, she found the forensic audit. The first page was a summary of her personal trust account, the columns heavily highlighted in neon yellow ink. It detailed the zero balance. The second page showcased the fraudulent loan agreements she had executed against Savannah's future assets. The third page featured the official bank notices declaring her historic home in default. I had arranged the documents so the evidence of her financial crimes struck her with the force of a physical blow. The blood drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin the color of old parchment. Her hands began to shake, the heavy leather folder trembling in her grip. She flipped to the next page, then the next, her breathing growing ragged and shallow. She looked for a release form, a check, a signed amendment. She found only the stark, undeniable proof of her own ruin. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a sudden suffocating panic. She opened her mouth to speak, to demand an explanation, to issue a threat, but her vocal cords refused to function. I did not lower my voice. I did not lean in to whisper. I spoke with the clear, resonant authority of a professional appraiser rendering a final verdict on a forged artifact. "I did not sign your amendment, Caroline," I said, my words carrying clearly across the quiet dining hall. The remaining ambient chatter in the room died instantly. Guests turned in their chairs, their attention snapping toward our table. The silence amplified the severity of my tone. "But as an estate appraiser, I did evaluate your household," I continued, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "You are bankrupt. You drained your own accounts to fund a lifestyle you could no longer afford. When that money vanished, you illegally leveraged Savannah's trust, taking out high-interest loans that you possess no means to repay. You spent this entire week trying to extort me, threatening to publish sealed adoption records, all to force me to cover your crimes. I am not paying your debts." The silence that descended upon the Carolina Yacht Club was profound and absolute. It was a heavy physical quiet, the kind that follows a lightning strike before the thunder rolls in. No one moved. No one picked up a glass. 180 of the most powerful people in Charleston sat frozen, processing the magnitude of the exposure. Caroline stood exposed under the bright chandeliers, clutching the forensic audit to her chest. Her carefully constructed empire reduced to ash in a matter of seconds. The silence inside the dining hall stretched into a physical pressure pressing against the eardrums of every guest in attendance. I stood near the raw bar, watching cognitive dissonance fracture my adoptive mother's face. For a fraction of a second, she looked merely confused, as if the English language had turned into an unrecognizable dialect. Then, the undeniable truth of my declaration penetrated the final, stubborn layers of her delusion. The polished, philanthropic matriarch vanished entirely. The carefully constructed features contorted, twisting into something genuinely monstrous. The skin along her neck mottled in harsh, uneven patches of crimson, betraying the pristine foundation she spent an hour applying. Her jaw unhinged, stripping away decades of expensive etiquette training. "You ungrateful little brat!" she shrieked. The sound tore through the elegant room, shattering the sacred decorum like a stone thrown through stained glass. "I took you out of the gutter. You were nothing before I gave you a name. You owe me everything." Her voice cracked on the final syllable, raw and ragged, echoing off the mahogany-paneled walls and the stern oil portraits of past commodores. A few tables away, Savannah sat frozen. Her blush silk organza gown abruptly looked ridiculous, a theatrical costume for a play that had just been canceled. The biological golden child had spent her entire existence wrapped in a cocoon of financial invulnerability. She never balanced a checkbook, never questioned the source of her luxury, never fathomed a reality where her whims were not instantly funded. Hearing that her own mother had secretly leveraged her future, that the trust she relied upon was hollowed out and defaulting, severed the fragile tether holding her upright. Savannah let out a sharp, guttural wail. She slumped forward in her chair, burying her face in her manicured hands, her shoulders heaving as she started sobbing loudly. She wept, not for the betrayal, but for the terrifying realization that the wealth was truly gone. Her safety net was shredded. Caroline ignored her crying daughter. Her eyes remained locked on me, blazing with a feral, unhinged hatred. I had humiliated her in front of the only audience she valued. I had stripped her of her status, her reputation, and her leverage in one swift motion. Driven by pure, blinding instinct, she dropped the leather portfolio. It hit the parquet floor with a dull thud, the crisp pages of the forensic audit spilling out across the polished wood. She lunged forward, her hands curling into tight claws, aiming her fury directly at me. I did not flinch. I did not step backward. I braced my stance, ready to absorb whatever physical strike she intended to deliver, refusing to grant her the satisfaction of my fear. Before Caroline could cross the short, expansive floor between us, the crowd shifted. The gathered elite, The senators and shipping magnates, who had stood paralyzed by the sheer vulgarity of the scene, parted. They stepped back in unison, clearing a wide path with hushed, urgent reverence. Victoria Rutledge stepped forward, her presence parting the room like Moses at the Red Sea. She moved with deliberate, unhurried grace, holding her crystal tumbler in one hand, her tailored silk gown rustling softly against the hardwood. She positioned herself directly between Caroline and me. She did not raise a hand to halt the attack. She did not raise her voice. She simply existed in the space, a monolith of generational authority projecting an invisible, impenetrable barrier. Caroline hit that barrier and stopped dead in her tracks, her chest heaving, her hands shaking, suspended in the air. Victoria looked at the trembling, ruined woman standing before her. She spoke with a voice barely above a whisper, yet the pristine acoustics of the silent room carried every single syllable to the furthest corners. Her tone carried the chilling, irrevocable weight of a judge delivering a final sentence. "Caroline," Victoria said, tasting the name with mild aristocratic distaste. "Your behavior this evening is a profound embarrassment, but it merely confirms what the board and I discussed earlier this afternoon." Caroline blinked, the feral rage giving way to a freezing dread. She lowered her hands, her breath catching in her throat. "Your accounts at this club have been suspended," Victoria continued, maintaining a terrifyingly polite cadence. "The board has been thoroughly notified of your current financial standing, as well as the fraudulent nature of your recent transactions. You are no longer welcome here. You are no longer welcome anywhere else in our circles. Your memberships are revoked. Your invitations are canceled." The oxygen seemed to leave the room. To be expelled from the Carolina Yacht Club was a staggering blow, but to be banished from the entirety of Charleston's aristocratic network was a social death sentence. Caroline had spent her adult life curating her position, sacrificing her morals and her adopted daughter to maintain a seat at this exact table. Now the chair was being kicked out from under her. Victoria did not allow her a single moment to mount a defense or beg for mercy. "You will leave this property immediately," Victoria instructed, her eyes flat and unyielding. "You will walk out those doors and you will not return. If you hesitate or if you ever attempt to contact my future daughter-in-law again, I will have the Harbor Police remove you for trespassing. I will ensure the local press receives the arrest record." It was the ultimate lethal severing of ties. There was no screaming match. There was no chaotic brawl. It was just a cold, polite, permanent excommunication from the only world Caroline cared about. She had tried to leverage my sealed adoption records to force my compliance, threatening to cast me out of polite society. Instead, the society she worshipped had closed its ranks around me, forming an impenetrable shield, and cast her out into the dark. Stripped of her flawless facade, exposed as a desperate fraud, and publicly ruined in front of the very people she sought to impress, Caroline seemed to shrink. The regal posture collapsed. The elegant emerald satin gown looked like a cheap, borrowed costume. She stared at the spilled pages of the audit on the floor, the stark reality of her bankruptcy mocking her from the polished wood. She had played her final card and lost everything. The realization washed over her, draining the last remnants of fight from her posture. She turned away from Victoria, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. She walked over to the table where Savannah remained slumped in her chair. Caroline grabbed her crying daughter by the upper arm, hauling her upward with rough, unceremonious force. Savannah stumbled, her face smeared with ruined makeup, clutching her expensive silk dress, letting out a final pathetic hiccup of despair. They did not look back. They did not attempt to salvage their dignity, because there was none left to salvage. Mother and daughter walked toward the solid double doors, their footsteps echoing hollowly across the silent dining hall. The guests watched them leave, their expressions a mixture of profound pity and clinical disgust. The social currency Caroline had spent her entire life hoarding was now entirely worthless, rendering her invisible in the eyes of the elite. The mahogany doors swung open, letting in a brief gust of salty harbor air, and then clicked shut, sealing them out in the humid night, leaving the yacht club in a state of sudden, expansive peace. The heavy double doors of the Carolina Yacht Club closed, sealing away the toxic current that had dragged at my ankles since early childhood. In the quiet space left behind, a profound stillness settled over the expansive dining room. The remaining guests returned to their seats, their voices reduced to a polite, steady murmur, gracefully pretending the ugly interruption had merely been a sudden gust of harbor wind. Weston leaned down, gathered the spilled pages of the forensic audit from the parquet floor, and handed them back to me, the leather portfolio safe in my grasp. He did not offer a grand, unnecessary speech. He simply pressed a kiss to my temple and signaled the waitstaff to pour the champagne. The rehearsal dinner concluded in peace, setting the tone for the rest of my life. I woke up the next morning to the soft light filtering through the sheer curtains of the Rutledge guest suite, listening to the distant call of seagulls over the Atlantic. For the first time I could remember, my chest did not tighten with the expectation of a manufactured crisis. There was no frantic knocking at my door, no urgent demands to manage an emotional disaster, no veiled insults regarding my origins. The morning air felt clean, untainted by the anxiety that had defined my youth. The silence was golden, pure, and unbroken. The wedding ceremony unfolded beneath the sprawling branches of ancient live oaks, the same monumental trees that had guarded the Rutledge estate for generations. Thick drapings of Spanish moss drifted in the warm coastal breeze, filtering the afternoon sunlight into a soft, dappled pattern across the manicured green lawn. Walking down the aisle, I wore the structured Mikado silk gown with the dropped hemline, feeling the heavy fabric brush against the grass. Every step felt intentional, anchored by a deep sense of belonging. Looking out at the assembled guests, I saw a sea of genuine smiles. There were no passive-aggressive whispers echoing from the back rows. There were no resentful family members demanding I shrink my joy to accommodate their fragile egos. The seats reserved for my adoptive mother and sister remained conspicuously empty, a silent testament to the boundaries I had finally erected. Standing opposite Weston, listening to him recite his vows in front of our chosen friends, I exhaled a breath I had been holding for 22 years. I was not waiting for the other shoe to drop. The sky remained clear, the ground beneath my feet felt solid, and the man holding my hands viewed me as an equal partner, not a convenient utility. The aftermath of my financial execution played out with the exact clinical precision Victoria Rutledge had predicted in the conservatory. The moment I signed our marriage license, the legal stipulations of my inheritance engaged. The trust funds vested immediately, transferring out of the independent fiduciary account and into a private secure holding under my sole discretion. Caroline lost her final avenue of escape. Without my signature to break the legal seal, she possessed no means to satisfy her mounting creditors. The collapse occurred rapidly, devoid of any theatrical grace. 3 months after the wedding, the bank initiated formal foreclosure proceedings on the historic Jade family home. The sprawling property that had served as the ultimate symbol of her aristocratic supremacy was seized by the state, its contents auctioned to satisfy the outstanding liens. The antique grandfather clocks, the hand-woven Persian rugs, and the sterling silver flatware I had spent my youth polishing were all cataloged, tagged, and liquidated to cover the debts she accumulated. Caroline faded into the margins of the city, relocating to a modest rental property in a neighboring town, permanently exiled from the society she had sacrificed her morality to retain. The wrought iron gates of King Street closed to her, and the silence from her former peers remained deafening. Savannah faced an equally poetic reckoning. Stripped of her golden child status and deprived of the endless credit lines she utilized to curate her identity, she was forced to confront the harsh, unforgiving reality of earning a wage. Possessing no marketable skills, no higher education, and no influential references, she found employment at a high-end retail boutique situated on the very same historic shopping district she used to roam with a platinum card. She spent her days steaming garments in a humid back room, organizing inventory racks, and serving the exact women she used to look down upon from the shaded verandas of the country club. She had to kneel on the floor to adjust the hemlines of debutantes who used to covet her social invitations. The wealthy women who used to endure her haughty remarks now handed her their discarded dressing room selections, offering tight, pitying smiles as they requested a different shoe size or a tailored alteration. She lived in the shadow of the world she once ruled, experiencing the same transactional dismissal she had spent her entire life directing at me. I never spoke to either of them again. I did not block their phone numbers or issue a dramatic final declaration. I simply ceased to exist in their sphere. I did not need to offer them a second chance because they had never truly offered me a first one. With the emotional drain of my upbringing permanently severed, I channeled my energy into my own expansion. I utilized a portion of my vested trust to purchase a commercial space near the Battery, expanding my appraisal firm into a full-service authentication and restoration business. The new office featured soaring ceilings, exposed brick walls, and broad windows that let in the Atlantic light. I hired a team of dedicated specialists, surrounding myself with professionals who valued meticulous labor and historical truth. Clients sought my expertise not because of the name on my birth certificate, but because of the sharp, unyielding accuracy of my evaluations. I built a career and a household anchored in honesty, leaving the fragile veneer of pedigree far behind. My adoptive family taught me a very specific, dangerous lesson about affection. They taught me that love was highly conditional, meted out in precise, calculated increments, based entirely on the labor I could provide and the problems I could solve. They viewed me as an asset on a balance sheet, worthy of shelter only as long as I generated a profit in convenience. But my chosen family, the people who stood by me under the live oaks, taught me a different truth. They taught me that my value is inherent, unchangeable, and immune to the opinions of those who refuse to see it. They showed me that respect does not require a pristine bloodline or a flawless social resume. My worth is completely mine to protect, and I will never again allow a desperate person to convince me otherwise. If you have ever been treated like the help in your own family, remember you hold the pen to your own ledgers. Do not sign away your peace. Subscribe to Calm Drama Stories for more. We spend our lives building homes, filling them with furniture, photographs, and the soft hum of daily routines. We believe that by providing a solid roof and a comfortable life, we are fulfilling our ultimate duty as parents. But a house is not inherently a sanctuary, and the traditional family structure, while a beautiful ideal, is only as strong as the truth it is built upon. The story of the Jade family is far more than just a dramatic tale of high society betrayal. It is a profound mirror held up to modern American society. It forces us to confront the quiet, often invisible spiritual decay that occurs when materialism and ego eclipse genuine human connection. As we navigate the complexities of raising children in a culture that frequently prizes external achievement over internal character, this narrative serves as a powerful cautionary tale about attachment, the illusion of control, and the true nature of love. At the heart of this reflection lies a crucial lesson about wisdom and the illusion of social currency. In modern American culture, the pressure to curate a perfect life is immense. We are constantly bombarded by images of flawless families, exceptional achievements, and seamless harmony. This relentless pursuit of the American dream can sometimes twist the traditional family structure from a haven of unconditional support into a competitive arena. We risk turning our dinner tables into boardrooms where worth is calculated by academic success, social standing, or compliant behavior. It is dangerously easy to fall into the trap of viewing our children as extensions of our own egos. We celebrate their victories as our own, and sometimes unconsciously treat them as accessories to bolster our social standing. Caroline Jade embodies the darkest extreme of this tendency. She offered transactional love, valuing her adopted daughter solely for the utility and public relations she provided, while simultaneously grooming her biological daughter for an empty, status-driven existence. The spiritual lesson here is both simple and deeply challenging. Children are independent souls entrusted to our care, not investments expected to yield a return in societal approval. True wisdom in parenting comes from recognizing a child's inherent, unchangeable worth, completely independent of worldly pedigree or social utility. When we attach our self-worth to external validation, we become spiritually bankrupt. We lose the ability to see the brilliant, authentic light of the child standing right in front of us. In a traditional family, the greatest responsibility is to provide a foundation where a child knows they are loved for who they are, not for what they can do for the family's image. The true responsibility of a family is not to produce a trophy, it is to nurture a human being. This brings us to the irreplaceable value of morality and the cosmic law of cause and effect. We often teach our children to be fair and honest, but the story vividly illustrates that the energy we project into the world inevitably returns to us, balancing the scales with unerring precision. Caroline and Savannah built their lives on a fragile foundation of deception, exploitation, and cruelty. They believed that as long as the surface looked pristine, the rot beneath the floorboards wouldn't matter. But integrity is not a performance. Morality is not about attending the right charity galas, living in the right zip code, or maintaining a flawless public facade. It is the quiet, consistent alignment of our actions with the truth. When we raise children in an environment devoid of moral integrity, when we prioritize appearances over honesty, we engineer our own ruin. Children are incredibly perceptive. They learn not from the lectures we give, but from the lives we lead. Parents must understand that teaching morality requires embodying it behind closed doors. The ultimate collapse of the Jade family was not a cruel punishment inflicted by the outside world. It was the natural, unavoidable consequence of their own karmic debts coming due. Fairness and honesty are the load-bearing walls of any healthy family. Without them, the entire structure eventually collapses under its own weight. Equally important in guiding the next generation is the cultivation of emotional awareness and the mastery of stillness. We live in a noisy, highly reactive society where anger is often mistaken for strength and volume is confused with power. Bianca's ultimate triumph was not achieved through vengeance screaming matches or destructive retaliation. Her victory was born from the profound, unshakable willpower of stillness. When she refused to sign away her trust, allowing her mother's desperate extortion attempts to fall on deaf ears, she demonstrated that setting boundaries is a deeply spiritual practice. As parents, one of the most vital skills we can impart to our children is emotional regulation. We must teach them that they do not need to absorb or react to the toxic energies of others, even when that energy comes from within their own bloodline. Willpower is the ability to stand firmly in your own truth, allowing the illusions and manipulations of others to shatter against your peace without losing your own balance. It is the quiet confidence of knowing your own value without needing to convince anyone else of it. Every day, parents stand at a crossroads, forced to consciously choose which paradigm will guide the next generation. On one side is the path of the ego-driven parent, who demands compliance to maintain an outward curated image. This path treats love and affection as a transactional currency, relying on manipulation, guilt, and the fear of lost status to maintain control. It is a path defined by the fear of losing authority over a child's destiny. On the other side is the path of the spiritually grounded parent. This approach cultivates and protects the child's authentic inner self. It offers the family structure as an unconditional safe sanctuary from a demanding world. It guides with transparency, fair boundaries, and unwavering moral integrity, ultimately empowering the child to confidently walk their own path. By embracing these lessons, by choosing authenticity over appearance, parents can break cycles of generational dysfunction. We can raise children who are resilient, morally grounded, and spiritually awake to their own inherent value. We all have to decide what kind of legacy we are leaving behind. If you are captivated by these deep dives into family dynamics, karma, and the quiet power of setting boundaries, make sure to follow the channel QT Told Stories. We explore the profound stories of individuals who reclaim their peace and rewrite their destinies, offering a space for reflection and vindication. As you look around your own living room tonight, listening to the quiet hum of your household, ask yourself, what unseen foundations are holding it all together? Are you building a stage for the world to admire, or a sanctuary for the souls entrusted to your care? We often believe that we are writing the story of our family's future, but perhaps in the end, the children are the ones holding the pen, silently recording every truth we thought we had hidden. And when they finally read that story back to us, what kind of ending will we deserve?